Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. Thank you for the hospitality. Okay. Right, I'm going to be addressing primarily the issue of EU citizens moving within the EU. But before I do, I think it's worth mentioning an issue to do with third country nationals. Because there's a prior question when we speak about voting rights, particularly when we're talking in relation to the European Parliament, which is, as it were, the basis on which seats for that Parliament are distributed. So, for example, Andrew Duff has recently defended a kind of Madisonian population base sits for the European Parliament, and i.e. the status quo, on the grounds that MEPs represent all of the population and not merely those who can vote. This seems to me to be a dubious argument for at least two reasons. The first is that it confuses the question of who representatives have a duty to represent with the question of who is entitled to select the representatives. Constituencies should typically be geared to the latter, i.e. demos criteria of eligible voters, rather than, as it were, population. So, for example, imagine you have two constituencies, each of which has 100,000 eligible voters in it, one of which has 100,000 resident non-citizens in it. Is that an argument that the latter constituency should be divided in two, and so we now have two representatives, 50,000 eligible voters acting for each? I submit not. It's an argument for giving greater resources to the office of the ME, of the representative who has the larger constituency, as it would be if you had a representative who had a constituency where the numbers of children was much greater than in another constituency. It's not an argument for a population-based measure. Now, this has one important consequence. If you adopt a population-based measure for distributing seats, this provides countries who have significant numbers of third country nationals with no incentive to incorporate them into the civic body. They get the benefit, they get the count of those people residing anyway, as far as distribution of seats goes. If, however, you adopt a more democratic eligible citizen, i.e. demos-based measure for allocating seats, that gives those countries an immediate incentive to incorporate third country nationals into the electoral body, to enfranchise them. Okay? So the population-based measure that the European Parliament currently uses provides no incentive to states to incorporate third country nationals. Okay, enough on that. I'm now going to just move and talk about second country nationals, i.e. EU citizens moving in the EU. So, one way to get a grip on this is to draw a comparison with two other potential free movement zones. So consider an intergovernmental system as the EU used to be, in which you have free movement grounded on a joint commitment to a common market. What does this imply with respect to external voting? Well, it may support it, or it may support preferential access to dual nationality for citizens who move, but only, as it were, instrumentally as factors that support or, in their absence, may obstruct the exercise of free movement. That's one comparison. Second comparison, the federal system. Free movement there is grounded on the norm of social justice. The reason why freedom of movement within the state or within the US, to take the federal example, matters, the reason why we don't restrict people from moving in the state is as a basic matter of social justice. So there, state citizenship is subordinate to federal citizenship, and jus domicilii is a perfectly acceptable rule for state citizenship. You just get state voting wherever you reside. Okay. So those are cases, and the EU is an intermediate case between these. It exhibits both intergovernmental and federal features, and the relationship of EU citizenship to member state citizenship is not one of priority of one to the other, either way. Round, you may get EU citizenship through member state citizenship, but member state citizenship does not have priority. So, freedom of movement and EU franchise problems. Well, local franchise, jus domicili for all EU citizens, outcome everybody gets one vote, and that's fine, no problem there. National franchise, there's no EU-wide rule and member-specific rules, and the outcome is you might get any of no, one or two votes in national elections. And the European Parliament franchise, there's a jus domicili rule plus member state-specific rules, so the outcome is you might get one or two votes. You've got at least one, you might have two, certainly in practice. So, two problems then. First problem is double counting problem. So the case of EU citizens with voting rights in national or European Parliament elections in more than one member state breaches the principle of political equality. That's obvious in the European Parliament case, because they have two votes in a single election, effectively. And it's also a problem in the case of voting rights in two national elections, since it gives them two chances to affect the identity of state representation at the EU level. So the double counting problem needs to be resolved. Exclusion problem. Well, since Treaty of Maastricht, freedom of movement is a civic right and not merely an economic right. It's a basic democratic principle that political rights should not be lost through the legitimate exercise of a civic right. Hence, exclusion from national franchise is incompatible with the political equality of EU citizens. How do you deal with the exclusion problem? Well, here are 4 different ways you could deal with it. You could give EU citizens who've moved second country nationals national voting rights in the state of residence, or you could give them national voting rights in the state of nationality, despite their being abroad, or you can just give them the choice between those two, or you could do a time-differentiated combination of them where you start with them having voting rights in the state of nationality, and after a given period of time that flips to the state of residence, so after 10 years or something of that. So, all and any of those options would resolve the current problem of political equality with respect to EU citizens. The first one, voting state of residence, obviously characteristic of federal systems, is disadvantaging the EU, but it would sever the democratic relation of EU citizens to their state of nationality. Once, as it were, your local, national, and EU voting rights are all in the state of residence, you've, as it were, lost your political relation to the state of nationality. The second one, having voting rights in the state of nationality, maintains that democratic relation, but it entails that EU citizens can't vote in what are arguably their primary context of rule, i.e. the state within which they reside. That might incline us to 3 and 4 as attempts to combine the advantages and minimise disadvantages of 1 and 2. But we can, this is my preferred option, 2+. So 2, voting in the state of nationality, when combined with rights of naturalisation in the member state of residence, that's 2+. This encompasses the 3 and 4 options and is superior to 1. Why? Well, 1, voting in the state of residence, devalues national citizenship and pushes towards a fully federal conception of the EU. 2+ acknowledges the mixed character of the EU as a polity. You know, if and when it ever became federal, it can shift, but at this point it would not be an appropriate rule. And the second is that 2 gets the distribution of political responsibility right. What I mean by this is that since EU citizenship is acquired through citizenship of a member state, the primary responsibility for ensuring that an EU citizen is not politically disadvantaged by exercising the right of free movement lies with the member state through which they acquire European citizenship, and not the member state in which they are resident. But, even though I like 2+, it's a good rule, and it would solve all the problems, it can't be legitimately imposed, even as a matter of political equality, let alone practice. The only strict requirement that emerges from political equality is that each member state, in conjunction with the EU, should ensure that their nationals are not disenfranchised as an outcome of exercising their freedom of movement rights. Okay, that's EU citizens who move within the EU. What about EU citizens who move outside of the EU? Whether they have external voting rights in, and here I'm just thinking now about European Parliament elections. Well, external voting rights of that kind are permissible, if not required. Currently, they just operate on member state-based rules. That introduces exactly the same kind of national arbitrariness problem that exists with third country nationals. So the best practice would be a common rule across all member states, which might be that, you know, no EU citizens outside the EU have external voting rights for European Parliament elections. That would be fine. Whether they adopt that rule or the rule that they all do for the first 10 years, doesn't really matter, as long as there's a common rule. Having a common rule matters in particular if you move to a demos-based system of allocating seats representation at the European Parliament, because otherwise you have the prospect of states potentially trying to kind of boost their representation in the European Parliament by enfranchising lots and lots of expatriates for EU elections, including potentially those who are nationals of other states, because of course they could do that as well. So let's suppose that Belgium decided that any EU citizen that didn't have expatriate voting rights in their own state of nationality could have them in Belgium, and so massively increased the pool of eligible electors available, and that would translate on a demos-based measure into more seats at the European Parliament. So, as I say, the important thing here is not particularly which rule they have, just that they have a common rule. Thank you.